it's hard not to notice that everything about what progressive humanism is doing is basically an inversion of the true and the beautiful and the good. We're almost required to worship the ugly in our society today, right? You must deny the beautiful and worship the ugly. And this inverted pyramid of kind of horrible cosmopolitan hedonism that they've created is an incredibly unstable structure, right? It's something that requires an enormous amount of energy to hold aloft because it's so against nature and so against God's law. And they know that at any moment, if they lose control, if they lose a little bit of power, if at any moment like natural hierarchy is allowed to reassert itself, the whole thing comes tumbling down, right? It has to, because it's so incredibly artificial. It's so incredible. It's such a lie that the smallest bit of truth is a huge threat to this.
Welcome to the Plain Speech Podcast. My name is Michael Clary, and I've got a great interview for you today. I just wrapped this up a few minutes ago with Auron MacIntyre. He's the author of Total State, which is a book, I'm about halfway through it, but Auron is a Christian. He's actually a member of a Southern Baptist church. But he's a good political commentator. He's conservative, and he is able to put words to ideas that I think you've seen and experienced, at least I have. Seen and experienced things that are just inexplicable, really frustrating as far as how things are going in the world. And this book gives, in an accessible, easy to read way, some great insight into what's going on. And we talk about explaining just how this machinery works. And then I think it'll give you good insight so you know how to react as a Christian, what to do as a Christian. One of the things that we see, especially is coming up, is Pride Month. So it's May right now, towards the end of May. So a little over a week from now will be June, and that is when we're going to see everything queer, gay, trans, whatever. We're going to have a month of it, and it's going to be shoved down our throats, and it's going to be really overwhelming. It's always just a month worth of controversy as these things play out. A lot of Christians, in my experience, they know things are wrong, they know they don't like it, but oftentimes they really don't have the language or the theological understanding really to know why is this wrong? I know that it's wrong, or I know that the Bible says it's wrong, but why is this wrong? What is the problem with it? So I want to commend something to your resource, and this is God's Good Design. And what this book does is it constructs a theology of sexuality from the ground up, using scripture, but in an accessible way. So it isn't something that is this high-minded theology that is just going to be very difficult and abstract and philosophical. The main thrust of the book is pastoral, because I wrote it as a pastor for people. Because I want people to understand, what does God's word say about sexuality? What does masculinity and femininity mean? What does it mean when the Bible says a husband is the head of his wife, or that for men and women to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and take dominion? Household theology, things like that. And why is fatherhood, motherhood? How do we apply these ideas in the modern world, but that is so different from the ancient context? The book itself is a positive vision for sexuality. And I've written it with a pastor's heart, and I think it's filled with stories and illustrations to make the concepts very digestible. But I wanted it to be a biblical presentation of a sexual doctrine, a doctrine of sexuality that would be a lifeline for you. You can get the paper copy. It's on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle. There's an audiobook version that is on Audible. And if you have the Canon Plus streaming service, you can listen to it there as just part of your streaming subscription. I recommend that book to you. Now let's get on with the interview with Auron. I hope you enjoy this. God bless. Welcome to the Plain Speech Podcast. It is an honor to have Auron MacIntyre with me today. Thank you for being with us today, Auron.
Thanks for having me, man.
So I'd like to start out just getting to know you a little bit. We're meeting for the first time today. And so I'd like to just hear you talk to us a little bit about your biography, background. Particularly, I'm interested in to hear about your Christian faith, because I appreciate your Christian testimony in the work that you do. So can you tell us a little bit about your faith and religious background?
Sure. I was really lucky. I was born to the Cleavers. I was born to two incredibly well-adjusted, stable, loving parents who love each other and, are committed to just raising a godly family. And so we were, at the church doors every time they were open for most of my childhood. My father was in the Air Force, so we moved around a lot early on when I was young, new Air Force base every couple of years. But the one thing that was pretty steady throughout that was kind of being in the Southern Baptist faith. It was always important for them to have us in a church, and so the Southern Baptist hymnal was kind of the identity I carried from each one of those places, even if I was moving pretty regularly. And so that was always a huge part. I got saved young. I think about 8 years old. And, like a lot of kids who get saved young, of course, things wax and wane, especially in the college years. It becomes very easy to fall away a practice and those kind of things. But I was always a believer. I always took God seriously. And, when tragedy really struck me personally, my faith was a pretty critical part of making it through. And so it's always just been something that I think has been pretty critical to my identity and something that's blessed me in many different ways.
That's great. Yeah, I'm Southern Baptist as well. I'm actually running for first vice president of the SBC that's coming up this June. Do you keep track of Southern Baptist life very much, or is that?
I don't, unfortunately. I have to. I know it's the political guy. You should have every office down. But honestly, when I walk in the church door, I just want to I just want it to be about God, and so I'm not as familiar with the inner workings, though I probably should be.
Well, there's some people that do. Not everybody can be stay right up to speed on everything. But there are some important things going down this summer. There's the law amendment, which is about women pastors and kind of ratifying that within our Constitution. So there's some big votes coming up, but I think that it's good for people to be aware as much as they can. But not everybody's going to get deep into the weeds. And I personally have not really stayed super on top of it. Through the years, I've been kind of focused on my local work here, but. Anyway, it's good to know that you're a fellow Southern Baptist, and glad to have a man like you in our convention. So I'm interviewing you as a Christian and as a pastor primarily. So I'm not trained in political theory, although I'm interested in it the way I think most Christians like me are. They care about politics because it intersects with their life. They see how political happenings impact our daily lives. So that's where I'd like to, take our conversation for a bit. And that's like, we need to understand what's happening in our world to live faithfully in it and prepare ourselves for what's coming. And I've heard you talk about your background as a teacher, journalist, and then political commentator, author, writer for Daily Wire. Can you tell me how those worlds all converged for you to do what you are doing now?
Well, I'm a writer over at The Blaze. I host a show and a writer over at The Blaze. But yeah, it's been a very strange transition. I began I got a degree in political science in college, and I focused in political theory, but there aren't a lot of jobs in political theory, and so I went ahead and I got a job as a history teacher. I ended up working on a few Republican campaigns as staff, but ultimately decided that wasn't a stable career going forward, and so I ended up falling backwards into journalism. I had a friend who worked at the local paper. He was the sports reporter, but their political reporter had been moved up to like Politico or something, some national outlet. And he desperately wanted to stop covering like the school board meetings and the city council meetings. He was pulling his hair out, and he's like, "Hey, I know that you know about politics, and I've edited some of your stuff you posted online about politics. Would you like to go ahead and do a couple freelance pieces for my paper?" I did that long enough. Eventually became a senior staff writer over there. And over time, just seeing how the sausage got made, actually being in the room, all the political theory that I had learned didn't map on to the way that things were actually getting done. It was nice to have this theoretical conception of power, all the things that we learn about in civics and the branches of government and all of these things. Well, when things were really getting done, it was very clear how much manipulation of the media and narratives and things like that actually shaped the way that people were responding to things. And then we had 2020 happen. And of course, everything seemed to blow up. All of the different things that I believed in, as Rush Limbaugh had taught me about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they didn't seem to apply. And all of the people, all the conservatives and libertarians who had told me that when tyranny came, all this stuff would stand between us and what would happen, they all seem to have like reasons why it wasn't such a big deal. They all had some equivocation that allowed them to kind of move beyond the fact that the churches were closed and the strip clubs were opened and we weren't allowed to go to funerals, but the Democrats could riot in the streets and burn down stuff. And so, I really needed to figure out what was going on. And so I started looking at political theorists that weren't in the mainstream. And as I did that, I started recording and writing about it and just basically doing book reports as a teacher, as a journalist. Okay, I know how to explain things, so I'll try to do that. And eventually it got big enough to where, guys like The Blaze picked it up, and that's what I'm doing now. So it's been pretty crazy, but of course I'm glad to be doing it.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I've appreciated about your work, and I'll pay you this compliment. I've always got my antenna up for writers and speakers who can take ideas and concepts that are big and they kind of feel overwhelming or intimidating. Like if you think about political philosophy or political theory, these are big, massive things, and it seems like you need to know so much history and so much background to really know all the inner workings of this. But you take those ideas and are able to distill them in very digestible, easy to understand little sound bites that are helpful. And it's like, oh, that you're giving a language to something I've seen and observed, but I didn't have the words for. And that's always really helpful. One of those, an example, this is not something that I've necessarily heard you use this language, but a lot of people, they encounter that sort of thing, and I hear them talk about getting red pilled. And for me, that happened to me.
Yeah.
In 2016, that was a big moment where I was kind of like, whoa, things don't seem to be going the way I had always thought they would. And then 2020, of course, was even bigger. All the things related to COVID and the election. And my grandfather, he passed away during COVID, and we weren't able to have a funeral. And so last time I saw him was in a nursing home, and then he died, and then he was buried. And then some time later, I was able to go to the cemetery to see where he was buried. But all of that was because of COVID. And I think that was a big deal for me, and a lot of people, I'm sure, responded in a similar way. And I still think there's some people that have yet to have that red pill moment. So here in Cincinnati, we've got a lot of normie, regular conservative people. They're kind of in fantasy land. They're kind of living as though everything is, things are maybe a little weird, but they're still content to, barbecue in the backyard, and they listen to Cincinnati Reds baseball on the radio, AM radio still. So if you were to assume that people are already conservative, already Christians that would be listening to this, is there something that you would say that they need to know to kind of awaken them to what's really going on, kind of pull back the curtain and see who's pulling the levers? Is there anything that you would say is like, this is what you need to know about the way things really are?
Sure. I think the biggest thing about approaching this is I love the normies. I'm a normie. Like I am normal. Like I do not have a revolutionary disposition. I am not the edgy guy who's like, oh, we got to have a revolution because to change. No, like I want to grill, man. I want to have a nice, kind of white picket fences life. Like, and so I think that's why when I talk to people, they often respond to what I'm saying, because I think they can feel like genuinely, I would not be telling you this unless I had to. Like there's no pleasure in this for me. But the biggest thing I think that people need to understand is that the Constitution, while a beautiful document and one that accurately represents, I think, an amazing moment in human history, is not a magical piece of paper. And the Founding Fathers knew this. They knew that ultimately the Constitution was only a reflection of the traditions and beliefs, the faith and the lifestyle that was common to them at the time. And it was the shared aspiration, the moral vision of where they wanted to go as a people. But that the document itself did not guarantee liberty or freedom. And they told us this. We don't have to guess at what the Founding Fathers believed about the Constitution. Adams has the famous quote, "It's meant for a moral and religious people. It's not for anyone else. It can't govern anyone else. And, as Christians, we'll often quote that, but we don't think about the implications of that. Okay, well, what if we aren't those people? What if we fell asleep at the wheel and we let the culture pass us by? For my entire life, people in religious communities, people on the right have said, we're right next to the point of no return. We're almost to that point where we'll lose the culture. We're almost to that point, and we never seem to get there, but things seem to get worse. And all I'm asking people to say is, what if that moment came and went? What if we went past that moment and we didn't take ownership of the fact that occurred? And now we're in this situation where we have allowed the government and we have allowed the culture to take away many of the rights that would have been central to our identity as Americans just a few decades ago. And we can't just sit around pretending like at some point the left is going to be like, well, they're right. We really should hold to our principles. At the end of the day, we really are Americans and we believe in all of these things, and we're shamed by our behavior, and we're going to turn this thing around. It's laughable, but that really is the way that most conservatives treat what's happening right now. It's like, if we just explain to them how hypocritical what they're doing is, if they just realize that the betrayal of American values that they're in the middle of, that at some point popular opinion will turn against them, and we'll kind of, but that moment never comes. Yeah. And so the question I want people to think about is why? Why are we in that situation? And what are some of the possible solutions for that? And so that's what I hope to do with my work. That's what I hope to do with the book I just wrote. That's really what I'm hoping to convince the average conservative Christian to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely squares with my experience. And as a normie conservative Christian myself, I feel like I've lived so much of my life under this delusion that other people approach life the way I do. They approach life like, fairness, equity, treating people well. The best idea wins, truth matters. People are interested in fair play. And I wanted to believe the best in people in such a way that I started to realize part of the red pill moment was being red pilled about myself and realizing I've been naive in my understanding of human nature, and I had to just get more comfortable and force myself to start to think and see in different categories than I was used to where now I'll have to get comfortable with saying there are really evil, wicked people, and it's not just the mass murderers and the serial killers. There are really evil, wicked people that are presented in the news as saviors and heroes and wonderful people. And there are enemies. There are people that literally do want to destroy our way of life. And I'm just like, that is so bizarre that anybody would be like that. But I've just seen enough of the world. There are truly wicked people. And there's a response from a godly Christian, which is not just leave me alone and I'll leave you alone. It's like their wickedness is imposing itself on other people. So as I wish I was able to get through more of your book. I'm about halfway through it. The book is called Total State. You can get it Amazon and all the places you would typically find books. So far where I'm at, I would kind of lay out a thumbnail sketch of the content and something like this. There's a government we think we have, and then there's the government we actually have. And the government we actually have is not democratically elected officials, but a cabal of shadow figures in journalism, tech, business, and other places. And they are the ones pulling the strings. How would you assess the accuracy of that assessment?
Yeah, no, that's correct. Yeah, the main thing to understand, the reason I call this the total state, at this point, most people understand what the deep state is, right? We have this conception. We watched Donald Trump get elected, and we know Barack Obama got elected to the same office, right? He's the president under Article 2, same constitution, should have the same powers. But when Barack Obama is in office, he can do what he wants. People listen to him, the branches obey him, organizations that don't even need to obey him just because of his position. He acts like a king, and everything works. Donald Trump gets elected to the same position, has the same powers, formally, and nobody listens to him. His generals literally commit treason and laugh about it, write books about it. His executive branch leaders ignore his dictates. The entire media, the entire NGO apparatus, everything is constantly trying to undermine him. They make up Russian collusion stories to keep him from being able to even act as in the basic office of the presidency. And at that point, we realize, okay, well, there's a lot of power that's not just in Article 2 of the Constitution, right? It's been moved outside of that. And that's really what we need to understand. Power always wants to centralize. Power never wants to be restricted. And so if there are formal barriers to power, then the best way for it to do that is not to necessarily remove those barriers if it can't get rid of them directly, but is to grow around them. And so what's happened is we've moved a lot of the powers of the executive branch into the deep state. And so we recognize that a lot of the things that Trump couldn't do were because the power of the presidency has actually been moved into this unelected bureaucracy that never gets turned over. There's no direct democracy towards it. But also that it's far beyond that, because once we created a system where popular sovereignty was the legitimating mechanism of our government, but we still had people who wanted to stay in charge, right? Like, they're not just going to be like, well, we'll leave because a bunch of people voted against us. Like, so what they decided to do instead was to build a system that could control democracy. Make sure that we have a managed democracy, a controlled democracy, one which always ends up producing the type of results that they want. And what you need to do that is really to manipulate the opinions of the people. And that's not a lot of like conspiracy or speculation. Liberals from the very beginning of mass media wrote books about how this was necessary. Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann is literally a book from the beginning of mass media explaining why it's the job of progressives to control the minds of the people through mass media so that they will vote correctly. They're not hiding the ball here. This has been the plan from the beginning. The whole disinformation, misinformation thing, that's not a new development. That's been here with us since the beginning of mass communication, mass democracy. And so what happens is slowly every single institution we have becomes dedicated to the job of controlling the inputs and outputs that people have that decide how they vote and who they support. And we can see this, right? We feel this creeping into everything, into our movies, into our sports, into our music, into our churches. Everything gets political. Everything has to be charged with this political energy. And that's why I call it the total state, because we've gone from having a specific government that has the job of managing the political to the point where basically we have an entire system where every single one of these institutions is working constantly to try to influence our political opinions, our political thoughts in order to maintain the system of power for the people in charge. And so ultimately, I think we've shifted out of the government we think we have, as you say, to the government we have now, but we never declared any formal changes. The system was built around, on top of, the scaffolding of our Constitution. So it's kind of wearing our Constitution like a skin suit. You know, it's moving around. It's got all the same names. It's got all the same institutions that we were taught to trust, but none of them are actually interested in what they're supposed to be doing. Like, the Department of Defense doesn't defend our country. It defends foreign countries. The Department of Education doesn't educate our children. It indoctrinates them with gender ideology. You know, like, none of the departments that have that name actually do the thing they're named after. All they do is work in service of the total state. So I think that's the big shift that most people didn't realize occurred, but it is nevertheless what actually is applying power to our current society.
Yeah, that's helpful. One thing I wanted to highlight out of what you said there is I think there's it could be somebody could be forgiven for thinking that what's happening is merely just cultural inertia pushing people in a particular way, where you have self-reinforcing ideologies and people just think things, and like postmodernism, which was the boogeyman that I heard a lot about whenever, you know, I was being trained in ministry 20 years ago, which is just like, it's like truth is relative, but it was more of just a way people think. But what you're describing is a little different, and something that was unexpected to me, and that this is coordinated, deliberate. It's a plan being carried out by people that have a specific agenda, and it's not just people being pulled along with cultural flow, but there are real incentives and reward structures that are built in for the people that are controlling this. Am I hearing you right?
We should clarify in that I do not believe that there is some kind of shadowy cabal giving 100% giving a top-down instructions. As I explain in the book, we don't have a Joseph Goebbels or a Politburo that has like a formal job of handing down. So I don't believe there's like an Illuminati somewhere that's typing out the orders and, sending them out to all the journalists. But what I do think is that you're correct that there is a marriage of ideology, yes, but also a particular structure of power, a particular set of systems that guide and incentivize people in a particular direction. So even though there's no centralized official message being handed down, that pairing of an ideology that's akin to a religion, progressive humanism, is paired along with a power structure that incentivizes people to construct their society a certain way. And so even though we don't have a specific marching orders coming down from a leader on high, we continuously have a self-reinforcing system of both power and ideology that work hand in hand to guide us in a particular direction.
So there's a quote here from Curtis Yarvin where you say, in a total state, everyone and everything is infused with power. Everyone matters. Everything is important. Everyone has to care. Everyone wants to change the world. Everyone must be engaged. Everyone is pushing power forward or pushing back against it. Everyone is either a collaborator or a dissident. Power has turned the whole country into a political cult. That's a very powerful quote in and of itself, and it makes me wonder: are we part of the total state, or can we extract ourselves from it? Or are we part of this thing that is inescapable?
Yeah, there is a very real there's a very real process in which dissidence is fed back into the system, right? So because we have this hegemonic ideology driving us constantly, pushing propaganda down to us, it needs an enemy. Like there's no good dynamic where like you're just in charge all the time and no one opposes you, and there's no like common enemy to fight against, and so you just rule with an iron fist. Like that's actually very destructive to power. People don't like that. The naked power of that is too obvious to people. So you really do need an opposition, and this is why we see kind of the feckless nature of the opposition that's been offered up on a pretty regular basis from kind of the conservative movement, the Republican Party. You know, they're the Washington Generals, to the Harlem Globetrotters. They're designated losers. You notice that guys like Mitt Romney and John McCain are like heroes of the left now. But I'm old enough to remember when John McCain was this evil baby killer who was portrayed as a vampire on the cover of leftist magazines. I remember when Mitt Romney was this homophobic genocidal monster who, killed dogs and gave kids haircuts because they were gay and stuff. Like binders full of women. Like we laugh about that now, but as mild as these guys seem, they were portrayed as Satan. George Bush is now this kindly old man handing Werther's candies to Michelle Obama, but he was a war criminal who was murdering children for oil, a few years ago, right? This is what the left does, is they put up these really ineffectual opposition leaders and treat them as if they're the next coming of Hitler, knowing that if that's as far right as you can go, if that's as much opposition as you can actually, gather, well, then you'll never look for any real answers. You'll never look anywhere beyond that. I mean, honestly, look, I think Donald Trump is very different than what has come before, if only because he says things that he's not supposed to say, and most importantly, he says them to people he's not allowed to say them to. However, ultimately, let's think about who Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is a left-wing, like he's a blue dog New York Democrat, right? Like he's pro-LGBTQ. He voted Democrat almost his entire life. Do you really think Donald Trump cares about abortion? I mean, let's be serious, guys. Like, it's Donald Trump. Like, we know who this guy is. And so the fact that they're calling this guy the most radical and insane right-winger of all time, what they're literally saying is the position of the Democratic Party like 15 years ago is Nazism. That's how they're treating him now. And why do you do that? Well, to make sure that no one ever looks beyond that. So there is something that we have to be aware of, where we want to find productive ways, but we also want to of opposing what's going on, but we also don't want to provide the enemy to the regime that they want, right? What the regime wants is fire-breathing, white supremacists, guys marching down the street. That's what they want. Those are the enemies that they want to put out there. Those are the people that they want to fight, but they can't find them, so they have to like pretend that Donald Trump is one of these guys. So there is a self-awareness we should have, where we are making productive moves that actually gain us power or reduce the power of the total state, but not feed them the types of enemies that they want without gaining anything from it. And that's a difficult line to walk, and something that I think we have to practice and be very careful about. But it is something that we should definitely be aware of.
Yeah. I remember, as you were talking about Trump and George W. Bush, whenever Bush and the Iraq wars were taking place, I remember explicitly thinking that it is not possible for a man to be more hated than George W. Bush is hated by the American left. And then Donald Trump comes along, and I was like, I'll be darned, they outdid themselves.
Yep.
Like, he is even more hated than George W. Bush. And it's like, if the man has an R by his name, then he is going to receive all that vitriol. And it makes me wonder, so you talk about the power that these people are seizing and controlling. Is there any, can you give any insight on what do they want? Is it just raw power? It's just like the ability to control, or is the ideology a servant to the power, gives them an avenue to seize power, or is it they're seizing power because they're true believers in the ideology? Can you make heads or tails of that?
This is a long-standing debate, actually, inside the field, or particularly the area of political theory that I focus on, which is Italian elite theory. So actually, there's a long debate on this, and my answer is this: Gaetano Mosca was a political theorist who talks about the political formula, and the political formula is the ruling ideology that legitimates the people in charge. Right? There's always an elite class. That's something that we need to kind of get over, the idea that there is not a ruling elite. There's always a ruling elite, and their ruling elite always has a story about why they should be in power. And Gaetano Mosca says it's important to understand that while we could think of the political formula as just this noble lie, like Plato's noble lie, where the leaders just tell this story that's completely false so that they can control power and shape society the way that they want. That's not what a political formula is. A political formula, it really only works if everyone buys into it, both the rulers and the ruled. You could make up a complete lie, a cynical lie, but people can feel how cheap that is. And ultimately, you just end up ruling with raw power. And you can do that for a while, but it always breaks down. So there's always this kind of, even in totalitarian government, there's always some level of consent, some level of buy-in with the populace that the rulers actually have a legitimacy in their rule. And there's always some level of belief by the rulers that they really do have some kind of mandate of heaven and that they should be in the position they're in. And so I think we are in a classic political formula scenario where does the ideology drive the power, or does the power drive the ideology? The answer is yes. These are symbiotic forces that are working together. So in one sense, I think that progressive ideology is critical to the way that power has been organized in our managerial society, because it allows them to break down traditional ways of life and remake people in the image of basically artificial widgets that lets them run the machine that they want to run at kind of full speed, create the most efficiency and power that it can. So in that way, it serves power. But I think reciprocally, the way the power coalition is built is entirely in service of this ideology that is necessary for them to feel like they are doing something that is worthy, right? They are always moving towards this equality, this equity. They're breaking down these traditional barriers of oppression and these kind of things. I think they really do believe that story, while also needing that story to kind of fulfill the power fantasy that they need to legitimate the rule and exercise their totalitarian state over the people that they're in charge of.
That is fascinating. I didn't know that there was a name for the thing that I was wondering about. So this is called Italian elite theory. Is that what you called it?
Yeah. So Machiavelli is obviously the first guy to come up with what people would call political realism, right? The ancients, we had political theory, we had Plato, we had Aristotle, we have Aquinas and those. Machiavelli is the first guy to break from this and say, okay, these are the ways we want power to work, we want politics to work, but here is the way that power works, right? That's what he's famous for in The Prince. Better to be feared, right? If we must. Kill the family of your enemy to keep them from usurping you. Like really brutal things, but things that, do play out consistently over time. And from that, other Machiavellians, others who have worked in the school of political realism, they tended to be Italian themselves, so Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, but others who are often associated with the school, like Bertrand de Juvenal or de Maistre, Joseph de Maistre. So it really just depends on who you're trying to include in, but that is kind of the loose cluster of political theorists who tend to fall along that line.
It's fascinating. I've got another quote from your book regarding the cathedral I'd like to ask you about. So here's a quote from the book. If there is no official state organ coordinating the message, no Goebbels pushing this from the top down, then why is the German cat appearing everywhere? For Yarvin, the answer is a decentralized network of organizations and individuals responsible for manufacturing a cultural consensus that he calls the cathedral. Can you tell us what the cathedral is and how it works?
Sure. Well, let me tell you the story of the German cat that I was referencing in the book, because I think that that is a perfect way to explain that to people. So Yarvin tells the story of this journalist, and he's in Germany in the 1930s, and he's Jewish, and he's reading his favorite cat magazine. The cat magazine has all the things you'd expect in a cat magazine. What are the best toys for a cat? What are some of the best breeds of cat? How should you take care of your cat? But slowly over time, he starts to notice that there are stories in the magazine about the German cat and the superiority of the German cat and why the German cat's character is above all others and why you should prefer the German cat. And by the end, as the Nazis are taking power, that's the only thing in the magazine. That's all the magazine is about, is the German cat. And we laugh, but we also could recognize this in our own lives, right? We probably all remember when comic books were about Batman and TV shows were funny, and you were allowed to go to a movie, or you were allowed to go go to church and get a sermon, and it wasn't all about leftist politics. But as we have moved on, whether it's our sports or our hobbies or our workplace, every single thing we interact with has this ideology baked into it. It's literally required by law when it comes to things like civil rights law and HR. And at this point, you have to ask, where does this come from, right? And so we already touched on this a little before, but if we are in a system where everything is talking about the German cat, but we don't have a Politburo, we don't have Goebbels, then what is doing this? And my answer is Yarvin's answer, which is this decentralized consensus-making apparatus, which he refers to as the cathedral. Some people don't like that illusion. They like to call it something else. That's fine. I don't care what you call it. The point is that when you have all these different consensus manufacturing apparatus, you have all these things that create the narrative for your culture, and they're all on the same page constantly. You have to ask why, if there's no centralized place to do that. And if we look back to Middle Ages in England, and everybody was speaking as if the Bible was well known. Everyone understood that Christianity was the morality that you followed. You didn't need to explain why we held wedding services a certain way. You didn't have to explain why your shop wasn't open on Sunday. You didn't have to explain why everyone was in church on Sunday. You didn't have to explain why we follow different cultural customs. Everyone understood implicitly, well, we all go to the cathedral on Sunday, and that is our religion. That's our belief system. And so that informs our marriages and the way we treat our children and the way we treat each other and the way we do business and the way we have a government and all of these things. And the same is true now, because all of our elites go to the same place. They all go to university. And when they go to university, they all learn about progressive secular humanism. And progressive secular humanism is the water in which they swim, even if they, checked Christian or Muslim or something on their way into the college. If they want to get good grades, if they want to get ahead, if they want to get jobs, if they want to get notoriety, if they want to get a romantic partner, they need to be well-versed in secular humanism. Like, that needs to be the background radiation, the firmament from which all of their social interactions spring. And so when they go out into the workplace, when they go become, lawyers or doctors or politicians, or they go run a news agency, or they work in the Pentagon, well, they all need college degrees, right? You can't do any of that stuff anymore without the college degree. And they all got the same indoctrination at the same seminary for the same amount of years, and they paid handsomely, by the way, to do it. And so when they all move into those areas, all those influential leadership classes, they take that ideology with them. And so no one needs to explain to the journalists, hey, you need to be enforcing progressive secular humanism. Nobody needs to explain to the army officer or to the the head of the corporation, hey, you need to go ahead and enforce this ideology, because it's all they know. That all their friends read the New York Times, they all watch the same shows, they all listen to the same radio, they're all quoting MSNBC, talking points back to each other. And so when they're doing that, like, they just naturally have this belief ecosystem. And that's really what the Cathedral is. It's a substitute modernist religion. It's a decentralized atheistic version of a theocracy that ends up dictating all of the ways that our government works and the ways that we talk to each other.
Yeah, that as you were talking about that, about the image that came to my mind was not a German cat, but of like all the queer animals on the that was on the
maybe you should update that for the rainbow elephant or something. Yeah,
right. It's like who is sending out the memo? It's like, all right, we need gay animals now. We've queered everything else that's human, so now we need to queer the animal kingdom and make them all gay. But it's like it's so on script. It is the thing that is just unsurprising at this point. So as Christians, there's this deep concern for truth and speaking truth, speaking plainly, as the name of the podcast. So I mentioned earlier that postmodernism was kind of the big boogeyman that was being warned about. I don't hear that so much anymore, but I was told how postmodernism would bring about the death of truth, and it seems like all those predictions have come true, even though I don't see people, postmodernists, taking a victory lap or people saying, I told you this is going to happen. But it does seem like it's happened, just as you describe. And so here's another quote from your book where you said, in the total state, no media is ever truly about its stated topic, but it's rather an opportunity to further state propaganda. The dissemination of the narrative becomes the primary goal of each and every media outlet. I've read some of Ellul, propaganda, Jacques Ellul, and I've also read what was the name of it? Is it how the news is making us dumb? What was that book? I'm forgetting the name of the book right now, but it was about consuming mass media. It might have been Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was a Neil Postman book. I'm losing the name right now, but similar ideas about how the information that we conceive shapes the way we think, and it even shapes the way that we perceive truth. And as you say with the Cathedral, there's this whole other alternate reality that indoctrinates people in leftist ideology. And so that leaves us with this conundrum where we could either just commit ourselves to ignorance and never know anything because we're refusing to consume media or refusing to trust media. But on the other hand, that makes us more vulnerable. So how should Christians, or anybody really, but how should Christians in particular think about media, and even how I think our conservatism can be exploited by propagandists and used against us? So even like the fact that we're conservative and the fact that we think a particular way, and even in conservative media, can you talk about how these things play out and what we can do as a response to uphold the truth and to not just be carried along with indoctrination?
So one of the dangers that people were correct about warning about postmodernism was the break of basically a cultural consensus, right? if you're going to abstract truth out of its grounding, so for instance, you and I live in a community together, right? We share the same experiences. We know what it's like around us. You can't lie to us about the condition of our neighborhood because we walk it every day. We live there. Our kids live there. We care about it in a very organic way. So when we say we want to conserve our community, we know exactly what we're talking about because we share that reality. But when you abstract that a level up, when you take us out of that community, that organic ground, and you say, well, we want to preserve something, but you don't walk it regularly, right? Like we're talking about an abstract, we're going to preserve a community in, I don't know, Kansas somewhere that we don't know, that we're not personally involved in. People could show us numbers about, oh, well, look, the GDP in Kansas is up and the average person is doing well, right? And so that's great. And we might think to ourselves, oh, well, that's good because we're about conserving that community and we want the health of that community to do well. But we don't know for sure that that's actually what's happening because we're not really there. We're allowing a level of abstraction between us and the actual lived reality of the people in that town in Kansas. So yeah, their GDP might be up, but maybe it's because they're strip mining the area, and sure, the people there are making some more money in the moment, but their water's going to be polluted, and eventually the mineral they're strip mining is going to be gone, and that town's going to dry up and blow away. And so was the community actually conserved? No, it was destroyed, right? But we don't know because we're not there, and we're looking at artificial measures of well-being between us and the well-being of that community. And so what the postmodernists warned about was really that they believed you couldn't get the truth because there's no, or I should approach this a different direction. What the thing that as conservatives we should be worried about is the level of abstraction between us and the thing we're actually trying to preserve. Because for a very long time, we were told that America was doing fine because our economy was good, right? Oh, our TVs are cheaper, right? Our homes, our home prices are going up because we're getting richer. But actually what we found out is it was becoming harder and harder for people to form families, right? That the instability of our communities was increasing even though our material numbers were going up. The line was going up, but the mental health, the spiritual health, all these other things were actually going down. And the reason I'm pointing that out specifically is I think it's really important for us, if we want to get back to a place where we can trust the things we know, is to divest ourselves from abstract institutions that are going to feed us data about places we don't know about and don't really care about to make us feel like we're conserving something. And instead, we need to reinvest ourselves into communities we can actually impact. I don't know if I can change Washington. I've only been to Washington a few times, and it's usually like flying through to go somewhere else. Really, it's just this abstract place I know crappy people go to pass laws that destroy my country. But I don't know if I can change that. What I do know is that I could probably get involved enough to change the lives of the people in my church. Or I could get involved enough to change the condition of my school district through running for school board or being involved in a county commission. I do know that if I get the right guy elected sheriff, if they pass some law that bans Second Amendment, he won't enforce it and he'll make sure I can still protect myself inside my county. And so we can chase the dragon of like trying to parse the truth out of all the news. But like, for instance, I work in the news and I'm not sure what's going on in Ukraine. Like, honestly, I don't know for sure. Like the amount of lies and deceit and manipulation are coming out of there are insane. And yeah, I could take some of the propaganda from the right and I could take some of the propaganda from the left. I could take some Russian propaganda and take some State Department propaganda and mix it together and try to get some of the truth out of it. But ultimately, the real answer is I'm never going to know. I'm not going to know what's really going on over there. And if I spend all of my time and energy trying to understand that conflict and try to parse that, but my community is dying, well, then I messed up. That's my fault. So I should be plugged into the things I know and that I can understand and that I can make a difference in, rather than obsessing trying to parse, foreign wars or things that just ultimately do not have a direct impact on my life and that I can't actually make any real impact on.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, the idea of localism. And there are a number of people that are doing good work in this area and are promoting this idea of localism. And as a way to protect ourselves from incursions of, a federal entity or some actor that would want to take what we have, but you can protect yourself locally much better than you can by trying to change things at the federal level. One name I'll mention to you, and for people that are listening to this may be helpful, is John Moody. He's a guy that is in Kentucky, not too far from me, but I followed his work for a while, and he deals with this from the angle of food in particular, of being self-reliant with food. So anybody that kind of resonates with this idea, I think just check out John Moody. He's on, I think he's on Twitter, but you see him more on Facebook. But then, he's really helpful in this regard of just helping to reestablish local infrastructure and local resources for feeding people, which is the most fundamental of our human needs. I wanted to ask you the only theological question, but it's something that I have an opinion on this, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this. So the level of coordination and sophistication that happens in this cathedral idea, which that sounds very real. I'm linking this to something you wrote about miracles and the sovereign. So you said the sovereign, this idea that the state has this transcendent sort of quality to it, to where it takes on characteristics that people would associate normally with some deity. So, and that's the sovereign. So the sovereign creates laws of how society works and reserves the right to suspend them via exceptions when it wants to, performing what would be the equivalent of a miracle, which is like, I create the rules and then I have the right to suspend the rules. And then, so that has this language of transcendence and religious quality, which could be a mere metaphorical way, or something that taps into just our human sense of the divine. But I'm inclined to think that there really is something to that something to the fact that there really are spiritual forces at work. So the cathedral, it sounds like a church, but it's doing a dark purpose, serving some dark purposes. I'm inclined to believe, I do believe this, I'm not inclined, I do believe this, that there really are dark spiritual forces behind these things. And from what I've seen, the level of sophistication and coordination to align all of these various levers of power to control people's behaviors, their thoughts, their feelings, their conceptions of reality in such a way that would not only be harmful to them, but would kind of obscure the truth of the gospel, the truth of Scripture, and it makes those biblical truths just seem so untenable because it's such a foreign way of thinking to how they've been conditioned to believe. So I really think that there are really spiritual forces. I think maybe in the Pentecostal people would call them like strongholds or something like that. But is that, would you agree with that? Do you have any thoughts about like how there might be a real spiritual element to all of these things, or is that just like not even within your field of study or interest to talk about?
Oh no, absolutely. Like if you escape this without believing in evil, then I don't know what world you're living in. One of the biggest failings of political science, in the realist sense, in the Italian elite theory, one of its major failings is its materialism. It is ultimately devoid of many of the spiritual aspects, and this is why I use it, but I go beyond it, because I think that it's critical to go ahead and understand that, yeah, the spiritual is real and that it has a very real impact. I think that we are experiencing I think we're going through a cyclical pattern that civilizations go through, which is basically a reenactment of the Tower of Babel. I think that we have a system that is built on disassembling God's order, then a natural hierarchy that is healthy for humans and a healthy way to have their societies assembled. I think it's specifically attacking those bonds of family and church and community that are organic and healthy for people. I think that it's taking that wealth and that energy and that prosperity that is encoded into those bonds and using that energy that it has stolen by breaking down those bonds to build up an alternative structure. It's hard not to notice that everything about what progressive humanism is doing is basically an inversion of the true and the beautiful and the good. We're almost required to worship the ugly in our society today, right? That's almost a central aspect of what we're doing. You must deny the beautiful and worship the ugly. And this inverted pyramid of kind of horrible cosmopolitan hedonism that they've created is an incredibly unstable structure, right? It's something that requires an enormous amount of energy to hold aloft because it's so against nature and so against God's law. And they know that at any moment, if they lose control, if they lose a little bit of power, if at any moment, like, natural hierarchy is allowed to reassert itself, the whole thing comes tumbling down, right? It has to, because it's so incredibly artificial. It's so incredible. It's such a lie that the smallest bit of truth is a huge threat to this. And this is why the left gets so apoplectic over the fact that, like, a football player last week said, "I love my wife and I'm glad that she's, like, raising my children." Like, they attacked him. I mean, there's no other way to say this. It was demonic, right? Like, they attacked him with the ferocity of a demon-possessed mob for the crime of saying, "I love my wife and I'm grateful that she raises our children."
Yeah.
There's no other way to put that. Like, that's exactly what we're up against. The good news is the Tower of Babel comes down. You know, like, the good news is that this artificial world that they are holding aloft is incredibly fragile. And guys just doing stuff like saying that and just being good people can actually just be a huge threat to that structure. And eventually it will come down. But the falling down of it will be terrible, right? Like, because so much of our society has been wrapped up in this. So it's comforting to know that I think that they ultimately cannot win, that ultimately, because they are in the opposition to God, they are in the opposition to the good and the true and the beautiful, they will lose. But the process of them losing is one which takes a lot of effort and courage on our part, and also a willingness to bear significant hardships, I think.
Yeah. It's so interesting you brought up Harrison Butker, because I posted on Facebook a meme, and the meme is about Tyreek Hill, and there's just some pictures of some of the children that Tyreek Hill had fathered. And it says, Tyreek Hill is 30 years old and has 10 children with 5 different women, but the NFL is only triggered by Harrison Butker telling young women or young people to get married and raise children together. And so you have, there's the apparatus and the way people think. It just swarmed him in a demonic way, like a demonic mob, such that there were girls I went to high school with that I haven't talked to in like almost 30 years, commenting about how misogynistic and mean that was. And I'm like, you didn't get to that conclusion on your own. That's a conditioned response because, as you would say, according to the language of your book, there's this cathedral that has this ideology that bakes in a way of thinking for people. That is, thank you for that word, because when I see this, I just think this is evil. This is demonic. There are spiritual forces at play. Man, thank you so much for your time. I've got more things I want to ask you, but I could talk to you all day. But this is very enlightening. Do you have any projects you got coming up that you're excited about, or anything that you would like to promote to the people that are listening to this?
Well, the main thing has just been getting the book out. That was it's my first book, and it's been it's a very interesting journey because I never expected to write it. So that's been the main focus here recently. I of course have my own show on Blaze TV. It also goes out on YouTube and as a podcast. It's the Auron MacIntyre Show, usually 3 to 4 times a week. I do talk about news of the day, but I also spend a lot of time on political theory and its application. So if people want to get a better idea, then of course the book, but also the show is the place to plug in. And I put out a column at least once a week with the Blaze, so I'm regularly writing something there people can check out as well.
Great. Yeah, I'll link to those things in the show notes. And just for the listeners, how I follow your work, there are I subscribe to your podcast, which comes out as the videos on YouTube, but I get the audio version as well. And you have long form interviews, about an hour or so long, with different guests that are very interesting. And then you'll do your readings of things that you've written, which are about 8 to 10 minutes long, thereabouts. And they're always very punchy and insightful, and I love those. Those are really helpful, and especially if it's some news of the day where you're able to get an insight with all of your knowledge of political theory and just how things are working. Insight in a particular instance of something happening in the world that applies these things, and I always find those very helpful. Twitter, and Auron's a great follow on Twitter. So make sure you check out all those things. And of course the book, like I said, I'm about halfway through it. It's one of those books where I find myself like, I'm just like, this is so annoying. I'm wanting to highlight all the sentences, and I'm like, so assume my whole page is yellow. So I'm like, what's the point of highlighting? I might as well just read it again and again. But it is very helpful. I love your ability to encapsulate big ideas with brevity and wit. So, Auron, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being with us today. It's been an honor.
Thanks. Great talking to you.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Plain Speech Podcast. Make sure you pick up a copy of Total State at Amazon and all the other places where books are sold. Make sure you follow Auron on Twitter, YouTube, and everywhere else that he mentioned before. Thanks for joining in, and we'll see you next time.